work now. Okay, so you should be able to see a screen, and we will dive right in. So I've been working on contract to the Greater Southeast Net Zero Hub. I do think they need a better acronym, to support community projects, primarily technically. So I'm a sort of generalist technical consultant across the whole sort of decarbonisation space. And part of that work, having got to the end of the RSF pot, has then been to look at what's been done and try and draw some conclusions and see what learning we can take from it and which can be applied. So I'm going to just run through some of that and then pass over to some of the other speakers to talk about some things in a bit more detail. So through the RSF project sort of run, in the Southeast, they've funded something over 50 low carbon community projects. And just to give you a bit of a feel for the sort of scale, because it actually covers quite a wide range. So on the left, you've got sort of nominal project size in kilowatts. And given that some of these are heat projects, it's a slightly sort of rough thing, but it gives you some idea that there's quite a lot that are in the sort of middle scale of sort of 50 up to 1,000 kilowatts. That's probably slightly more than half. There's a few quite small ones. But there's also some really quite big ones. In fact, I think the biggest was 16 megawatt for a PV project. So community energy doesn't have to just be something small and local. It can be quite ambitious. And then in terms of the sort of the lead technology, if you like, there are a lot of them that are a mix of different technologies, but we've tried to sort of identify which is the driving technology, if you like. And probably about half of them are generation projects, so hydro and PV. We did have one successful wind project, but it was a bit of an oddity because it was an off-grid system in the middle of nowhere, and it was only a very small turbine. But and then slightly less than half of those are going to be around heat. So you've got quite a good number of district heat network schemes, and then some individual ground source and air source heat pumps, and a very small number looking at battery storage. In fact, there's only one project really that I think counted as having that as the lead, which was an adding battery storage to an existing solar park. So just starting with sort of generation and storage as sort of being one sort of generic type of project. Across the piece, we had 11 that were sort of more local roof mounted or multiple roof mounted. We had a number of communities which were looking to do roof mounted solar across a number of properties. And on the whole, those would be pretty straightforward. The economics are pretty good. They're less prone to running into problems with grid and so on. And those have been pretty successful projects, but they are relatively small scale, a few hundred kilowatts typically aggregated. We had 3 in that difficult middle ground where it's a grid connected ground mount system. And one of those was an extension to an existing solar park. So that's progressing. But the other 2 were sort of new systems, and they're quite tricky because the economics at this scale are just a bit marginal. You haven't quite got the scale to get the costs down. Grid costs and some of the other costs of planning and so on are quite a large chunk of the total development cost relative to the size of the project. And so these have proved to be a bit more tricky to get off the ground, and grid has been an issue with those. And then the next size up, of course, you know, if it's not one thing, it's another. And with these ones, it's planning that's been more of an issue. In one case, we've got a planning issue where they've run into a problem where they're being queried on drainage, and it's hard to see why putting solar panels in a field should actually mean there's more or less rain. But for some reason, the planners have got hold of this, and there's a neighbouring housing estate that's had flooding issues, and they're concerned that it might increase flooding. So there's always something to sort of trip you up. And 2 of the projects are part of the Riding Sunbeams program, which is looking to co-locate solar with the rail system. And they've slightly hit the buffers, bad pun, on the fact that the National Rail are now saying, well, how do we know that your renewable energy is going to be value for money. And they're saying, well, it's much cheaper than what you're buying from the grid. And say, oh yes, but that's not the point. We need to know that you're good value against other renewable providers. So I don't quite know where they've got to with that, but that's been rumbling on for a while. So yeah, so there always seems to be something to try and trip up people trying to do good stuff. So technical feasibility for PV generally isn't an issue. We know what PV does. We've got good modelling. Everyone can agree on what it is. Hydro, though, it's quite a major deal. And one of the issues we've had, I think, with the RCEF structure is it didn't really recognise that feasibility is not a one-size task. So doing feasibility for a bunch of roof-mounted PV is almost trivial, whereas doing feasibility for a sort of a weir-based hydro scheme or for a district heat network is quite a major task. Wind, I'd say, is still almost impossible, sadly, because that's my background. And then battery storage is interesting. We've had this has come up a number of times, and this tends to run into slight issues in that it's very difficult to forecast accurately or robustly what the revenue stream from battery storage will be. And then once you get to the point of thinking about community share issues and so on, that can be a concern. And it would be interesting to hear some opinions on that. I think we've got someone from Share Energy on, I think Fran's on the call. So it'd be really interesting to hear their view on that. And everybody, of course, struggles with grid connection. But I think that is definitely one of the things where it's a moving situation. And projects that were kicked back 3, 4, 5 years ago because of grid, it's definitely worth keeping on hassling the DNO to see what the situation is, because that does change. And of course, energy economics are the other big volatility. I think the current situation is best described as improbable, and also probably not sustainable, because fundamentally we've still got cheap oil. So I think we're going to come back and talk about that, because that's a key thing. District heat network projects, this is a whole different can of worms. And it's been quite interesting just doing a review over the last sort of 3, 4 years of the different feasibility studies done by different consultants. And I have to say that one of the problems is these are a group of people that you couldn't get to agree on the color of an orange. It's extraordinary how different the approach has been. You've got some consultants who've just ruled out various things and said, well, that can't be done, where others have said, well, this is quite a good approach. And I think that the generic learning from it is that actually they're just very complicated, and any sort of fairly simplistic approach, like putting it into one of the standard models, for example, is unlikely to yield the optimum results. So we've had 18, I think, projects running. I think actually maybe slightly wrong. So I think when I was doing my quick sum yesterday, I might have counted the ones that did stage 2 twice. So I think it's nearer 14 that have gone through in the southeast. And some of them are quite small, others are much, much bigger. We've had attempts to extract heat from rivers, sewage, just the ground, and various other variations on that theme. And I guess that one of the things has been is there's been a lot of interest growing in this, partly because of the publicity around Swaffham Prior. And I do tend to say to people, Swaffham Prior has been the bane of my life over the last 2 years, because people are looking at Swaffham Prior and said, oh, if they can do it, we can. And actually, that's not necessarily true, but I'm sure others will come back onto that. So I mean, just in terms of those issues coming through, in terms of those sorts of projects, there is very much a solution before problem approach. Communities see someone else like Swaffham Prior have done something, and think, oh, we'll have one of those. And what this can lead to is you get a group in the community who are very enthusiastic, charging off in a direction that's totally unviable. And then you're going to try and draw them back and say, no, hang on, go back to first principles. What do you actually need? And of course, the thing you find when you look at any of these heat schemes around sort of disparate, slightly low density communities, is what they actually need is insulation. And then they can start to look at heat things. But so that can be an issue. Constrained grid is obviously a big issue where you get communities where 2 or 3 people have put in generally large detached properties with relatively rich occupants have put in ground source heat pumps, and then the grid is starting to say, well, actually, you're running out of grid, so that can be a problem. So yeah, so all sorts of drivers to that. I mean, I think most people are reasonably well aware of this, and one of the things that came out of the study was that there was an awful lot of reinventing the wheel going on, and people were being paid to basically advise on the obvious. But if we look at this in terms of revisiting those studies, I think one of the things is that it's worth going back and revisiting against current conditions, because a lot has changed. We've got early projects that were costed up according to the availability of the renewable heat incentive, which has disappeared. And then in the middle, we've got ones that were costed up when there was no support at all, when actually for these heat networks, we've probably got availability of up to 50% of capital funding from the Green Heat Network Fund, if it carries on, which it looks like it will. And so it's definitely worth revisiting them in order to get another view against today's economics. Obviously, the other thing that's in flux is the fundamental comparison between fossil fuel heat as a source and electricity. And again, it's slightly in flux. I think we're going to come back onto this, but if some of the things that have been in consultation around taking some of the carbon levies off electricity happen, that will start to tilt the balance, and it'll help to make renewable heat more cost effective from a running cost point of view. Yeah, and I think, as I've said, Hindu can support development, and the Green Heat Network Fund can support capital. So that's worth reassessing any of these projects against it. And also just experience is growing, costs are coming down as we see more of these being adopted. And even just things like legal costs, and the cost of setting up all the legals, that's all been done now several times. There are lawyers who now they understand all the requirements to do the business of a community interest company selling heat to residents, and that's all been worked through. So that helped bring the cost down. So yeah, so I think in the southeast we're going to be working through all these projects again over the next 3 months. I think other hubs are doing the same, and there are other sources of funding. I think heat networks in particular are getting a good push from BEIS. It's a bit more difficult for some of the other projects, but there are a range of funds popping up, and Community Energy England have a particularly useful website with a register of funding that's available. So I'll sort of pause there, and I don't know if there's any, if you want to take specific questions at this stage, or whether you want to move on to the other.
Thank you, John. I propose that we move on to the second presentation, which is Callum, who's going to talk about some of the market changes and also I think Callum's views on mainstreaming innovation and innovative funding techniques. Is that right, Callum?
Oh, yeah, I'm just muted. Yes. Okay. Approximately.
Let me just mute myself. Okay.
Perfect. Many thanks, Liz. Lovely to meet you all. Good morning. I'm Callum Milbank from Community Energy South. I'll just be talking around the wider market conditions and caveat with the comment that I am not a financial analyst, short or long term. I've got an engineering background, so the techno-economic side of the project feasibility is a good place to start, but just trying to broad strokes paint a picture of what we might be seeing in the near and long term in terms of energy price markets and how that will affect projects. So if I share my screen, I am not the best with PowerPoint.
Yeah, that's working, Callum.
There we go. So revisiting our feasibility studies, we often think of them as a bit of a snapshot, and we're all understanding that there's a huge amount of volatility in all of our lives individually and at a national level and internationally. The effect that that's had on manufacturing, unit energy prices, supply chain issues can't be understated. But there is opportunity in that as things shift around to potentially revisit things that we once thought weren't viable. If they were marginally unviable or if they were considered a complete dead end, we should still potentially look at them as pathways that we might now be able to go down, especially in terms of decarbonisation as the goal. If we can make them stack up a little bit, it's important that we do that at pace. So yeah, I'll just talk around the energy market and the energy price cap. So we've had another energy price cap increase. We're going to see that head up towards the 4,300 mark over the next quarter coming into 2023. But we've got a little bit of a in terms of a near-term perspective, we've got a little bit more security up till April 2024 with the energy price cap guarantee. And domestic and commercial gas and electricity prices tend to track together, with domestic being 10 to 15 pence more expensive. So it's a good indicator if we look at the domestic market where the commercial market will follow. And so we're seeing prices already at the 30 pence, greater than the 30 pence per kilowatt hour mark. And for commercial tariffs, we're also seeing tariffs in excess of 20 pence per kilowatt hour in terms of power. And we shouldn't be surprised to see those kinds of prices continue on. I'll go into the kind of long-term view, but definitely up to April 2024, which when looking at a 2025, 30-year project is a little bit marginal to, or it's not the wisest thing to base your project on a 2-year set of assumptions, but the impetus to bring those prices down is definitely coming into the forefront of domestic and commercial consumers. So yeah, I think on the PPA style arrangements specifically, that's where generation technologies should start to stack up favorably. The policy around grid feed-in is still very weak from a government perspective, but we do have energy suppliers like Octopus who are negotiating innovatively around increased SEGs, so smart export guarantees, and helping community energy projects with short-term, very large feed-in tariffs that get them over the initial capital expenditure. So it's worth engaging energy suppliers and thinking about some of the short-term changes that can be implemented in a project to get the ball rolling, so to speak. So power, electricity prices still, yeah, very high in comparison, but natural gas, despite various global affairs and despite various warnings and reports, strangely, natural gas is still, or maybe not so strangely, it's still heavily subsidized. And if we look at how that stacks up with heat pumps specifically, it tends to pan out that on the economics based on the energy, heat decarbonisation projects using heat pumps are going to be largely similar in terms of the challenges, largely similar in terms of the finances than they were before these massive price increases. And so there isn't as much to capitalize potentially on this increase in cost gradient. But that's not the whole picture. We are seeing some innovation around the use of standing charges and how they've doubled over this last short-term period, and particularly with district energy, district heating and cooling networks, front-loading that capital expenditure, the high capex that you're inevitably going to have, front-loading that into the standing charges is potentially one way of financing long-term the initial build. And what that means for non-district heat networks, for generation projects in general, where we tend to look at a single large consumer and we'll try and meet their overall consumption needs, or a large portion of those consumption needs for power. It implies that multiple off-takers can benefit from this increased standing charge, in terms of, and the standing charge is just there to build and maintain infrastructure. So if we kind of treat it as such for very small scale projects and start thinking about microgrids around power, then that might be worth pursuing options around viability in that respect. And I've put some points in there about overhead distribution versus trenching, the use of battery storage, smart metering and controlling, kind of tools that and concepts that are already in existence, already being applied elsewhere, that if you bring together might start to make microgrids, for instance, stack up. And it's difficult because we still have high energy or high per unit energy storage costs, with battery storage still in the region of £1,000 per kilowatt hour. But there's still potential in there to look at how that long-term project financing can be used. And I've put in some numbers around standing charges maybe amounting to around 25k over a project lifetime for around 10 consumers. And so what would that buy you? Would that buy you some storage? Would that buy you some overhead distribution? It's what I think it's worth looking at some of the concepts that we don't typically look at now that we may have some more finance to play with. But DH projects, as stated, DH projects do lend themselves very well because they have, potentially large numbers of multiple off-takers paying that standing charge regularly. So hopefully this should be a financial mechanism for them to start to capitalize on. So going into the long term a little bit, again, very broad brushstrokes with this, and caveats that we really don't know what will happen. And I think businesses and individuals are hoping for stability, and I think that's the main takeaway. They're hoping for stability because the longer that the volatility kind of continues, the more existential the challenge to their daily operations, if they're commercial, or that just their daily lives becomes. So that kind of puts the long-term stability and supply resilience that you get with a renewable generation project, that puts that right at the forefront. And Cornwall Insights seem to think that energy prices will still be about double their historic average after this peak that we're seeing now kind of settles down around 2025, which is, if we have manufacturing and installation costs staying largely the same, this is still a big margin to start to move on in the installation of PV or hydro, or potentially now even onshore wind after there's been yet another U-turn. So it is worth considering the long-term UK market changes and the long-term global energy price increases from a risk aversion point of view. And this is how potentially lenders will see this. They'll be risk averse in assuming that prices will drop down low. It's worth capitalizing on that and looking at projects that maybe were not unviable by a marginal amount, but were potentially needed a fair amount of additional profitability to become a viable project. And so what does this all mean for feasibility studies? As I said right at the beginning, we often treat them as static. It's just snapshots of where we are with our economics, where the technology is, and the current time that we're in and that we're going into, both the market and the UK policy and regulation. That volatility means that we should potentially be treating feasibility studies in a more dynamic way. And that can result in reassessing your economic modeling parameters around your energy, around procurement costs. Legal and finance has been mentioned. Legal costs are coming down as we establish straightforward and as we establish best practice for setting up share offers and setting up co-ops. Finance costs are also coming down as more and more lenders are looking at the stability, the inherent stability of renewable technologies. Install costs can be affected by supply chain issues and a little bit of a bottle, maybe a large bottleneck in supply and skilled install labor. But that should also even out over the medium term. The reassessment of the technologies employed should also be done. Where you're looking at air source heat pump as opposed to ground source and the efficiency differences in that, because you're worried about the capex with air source versus ground. Do the long-term operating costs now push the efficiencies of ground source? Do they overtake those larger capital costs for sinking boreholes? So it's worth having a look at those fundamental parameters that were considered early on. Working innovatively with key stakeholders, so working with local authorities, working with commercial, working with groups of individuals to establish that medium and long-term stability and put that as a main selling point. It's difficult to quantify in terms of economics. How much is it worth to you to be able to operate with a steady energy price for 10 to 15 years? For some, they'll quantify it as this is the cost of however much you're planning to charge me in the PPA. For others, if their operations have a degree of risk, it will be absolutely fundamental. 12 to 18 months of difficult trading where prices have doubled or tripled might be enough to end long-term in operation for good. So there's lots of aspects to think about in how you present that long-term stability and resilience alongside the hopefully now favorable economics, and potentially consider multiple stages for feasibility studies, not just the straightforward kind of static snapshot of the project outline, but also go back and work with energy suppliers, ask them if the modeling parameters that you've used can be adjusted to set the project up as slightly more favorable. Work with them and go back and refine those models. Don't just kind of leave them on the shelf. And to help you do that, to help you refine those models, we've very graciously had offers of professional assistance to review community energy groups' feasibility studies. We've had Phil Proctor from Bureau Happold, Mike Beach from Marina Tech, and Rory Langdon and Miles Messenger, who are on the call and will be presenting from Bouygues, have all offered to assist in revisiting some of those parameters, some of those core assumptions, those initial assumptions, but also kind of working through adjusting different economic modeling parameters to really fine tune and work out if a project that was completely unviable before or only marginal might actually stack up and can be taken forward. So I think you can contact us directly, definitely, or you can directly contact the organizations potentially as well.
Probably better to go through
But
Melly.
yeah, I think Liz has just said it's better to go through her. So give us a shout if that's of interest. And yes, we hope to get more projects out there in the wild and to get them going. So many thanks. I'll pass on to the next speaker now.
Thank you very much, Callum.
Liz, I think you might be on mute. Liz, I think you're on mute.
Right, so I'm handing over to Miles. Can everyone hear me all right?
We
Yes,
can. Now,
great.
yes.
Who works for Bouygues. He's going to talk about scope evolution and going from feasibility studies to construction. They interestingly have worked on swap and prior, so we could have a very interesting debate here, but I'm hoping we're going to keep this debate around feasibility studies and how you can make the most out of feasibilities that might be sitting on your shelf. So Miles, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, and for all my sins, yeah, I was very much heavily involved in the Swap and Prior project since 2018 and have seen it evolve and morph. So there will be an underlying tone about that project in particular as I go through these slides. Can you see my slide there?
Hold on just a second.
Sure. Excellent. Okay, great. All good?
Yes, go.
Brilliant, thank you. So firstly, the elephant in the room, how to pronounce our name is B-W-E-E-G, it's Bouygues. My name's Miles Messenger and I'm the engineering director for the energy team. I'll just quickly skip through. Bouygues is an enormous company, multidisciplinary engineering and construction company. So we're not, let's say, super well known amongst everyone. So just so that we know who we are, we're one of those construction giants that don't normally get into the public eye. Just as a bit of context for how large we are, we actually dug our way to the UK from France, which is our origin, via the Channel Tunnel. So we were responsible, I think, for the French half of the Channel Tunnel. In terms of Bouygues Energies and Services, where I sit within, effectively with the engineering division of the business that spans, well, basically energy, digital and industrial transformation across the built environment. And as I mentioned, my team is heavily focused on energy and low carbon retrofit projects. In terms of where we get involved, so we're responsible for the design, build, operate and maintenance of our projects. And these are all focused on net zero. One thing I think is important for these discussions is we offer what we call an energy performance contract as part of our work, which means that we're effectively committing to the long-term performance and the economic models. And the reason this is important is we are responsible for doing a lot of the economic modeling throughout the process. And we too understand the points that both John and Callum made around energy price volatility as well as capex and opex costs, because we're having to do those sensitivity assessments to work out the impacts on project economics. Just as a sort of a flash as the sort of projects that we get involved in. So we've delivered several large-scale solar farms across the UK, solar carport projects, which again my team's been heavily involved in. Swap and Prior heat network is a good example of one of our heat network projects that we've delivered. This is just some examples of that. We are involved in multiple low carbon retrofit of heat projects, as well as, in this case, LED street lighting. So effectively, we span quite a few areas of technology that are pertinent to these discussions. But anyway, that's Bouygues. That's out of the way now. And I'll go on to talk about the specific theme of this discussion. Liz asked me to talk about project evolution. So to contextualize this, Bouygues, our role, like many of our sorts of organizations, we're taking those initial feasibility reports and taking them all the way through the development and ultimately into construction. So it's essentially the the relay stick is handed over to us to then take forward. So it's a good sort of juncture to look ahead. What I think the point here is that it is a long road. It's a long journey from where we are from the feasibility study all the way through to construction. And I'm here to sort of talk through how the project does evolve through there. So I've illustrated this with one line, very simplistic, from inception all the way through to construction. The way I see it is we start off with a bit of a crayon drawing, and it's our job to turn that crayon drawing into a real project. In terms of timescales, we're going from, I would say, a feasibility study that can take anything between, well, it's arbitrary here, but maybe 3 to 6 months, maybe a bit shorter for the most simplistic of projects, a bit longer for some of the most complex, but it's a relatively short journey in the context of what comes next, where we then have a series of design, statutory consents, budget revisions, develop design, procurement, more funding discussions and budgeting, project financing, and then ultimately leading to a contract award and then more design. So there really is quite a long pathway for us to follow. In our experience, shortest might be maybe 6 to 9 months in development. Longest we can be looking at north of 2 years in terms of timescale. So it is a very long period of time that we're going through that development cycle before we're actually breaking ground. And this brings in the whole thing about what do we need to consider in those 2 years in terms of what's likely to evolve in terms of the economics. Colleagues have talked about technology, an evolving client brief, and so on and so forth. So all of these things sort of play into it. Our job, we have a design framework that we operate to. There are sort of 7 key stages. I would say that the feasibility studies that are delivered under the RCEF would be sort of covering the first 2 stages as we see it, which is really taking it from that initial brief into a first stage concept. And we're then taking it all the way through those stages of construction. I think the important point here is that as the project goes through that constant refinement and development, we're slowly and systematically reducing the risk and uncertainty of any project that's being developed. At the early stages, at concept stage, and as part of these feasibility studies, whilst their job is, the job there is to try and identify the risks that could emerge on a project, it really is a case of having to try and quantify and qualify those risks and systematically eliminate them through the course of design. That's our challenge, and that's what we're here to do. In terms of, I always think about the evolution of design as kind of a funnel. That the initial feasibility studies that happen there, it really is a sort of the high level option selection. What technology? What purpose is it serving? How is it meeting the brief? But it's very much the sort of the early emergence, the crayon drawing, as I mentioned. We're then going through this constant refinement and shortlisting and optimization of design before we actually get to a full specification and know exactly what it is that we're doing, and how it's going to meet that brief. We think of design as being this sort of straight line process, this linear plan that will go from A to B to C to D and so on and so forth. Whereas in reality, no design process is straightforward. There are constantly rabbit warrens to fall into and mousetraps, as it were. It's kind of like snakes and ladders. And it is a circular constant evolution of design, as it were. So I think it's worth pointing that whatever we start out with, there will be changes that take place throughout the course of compared to what we thought would be the case. Coupled with that, we've got technology evolution. I know, Callum, you mentioned how, effectively those projects that may have been sitting gathering dusts for a couple of months or years, they might actually need to look at seeing if the technology has moved on since then. When you're in a live design development, it's even more tricky to account for these things, because we, effectively, if it is a year or two of development, technology is moving so fast that you could end up, if you're not careful, with obsolete technology incorporated into the design. So that's the thing that we don't want to end up with, is effectively a Betamax or a Kodak at the end of a design process, merely because we've not kept up to date. But at the same time, we need to be mindful not to continually look to refine and update our design, because that will trip over itself if we're constantly having to incorporate new technologies into a design process and updating and revising and evolving. Equally, with all of this new technology coming through, the level of maturity also needs to be considered. Whilst we're always keen to be using the cutting edge techniques and products that are available, we've also got to be mindful of making sure that they are going to stand the test of time and deliver on the resilience requirements of any project. And coupled with that is availability. Whilst the technology may have been developed, does it exist? Is it purchasable? And will it be available for your project? Alongside our engineering, design, and technology, we've got to consider policy and regulatory evolution. Now, I think, John, you mentioned the RHI renewable heat incentive coming and going, and how some projects, some feasibility studies that were completed were anchored around renewable heat incentive subsidies. This is something that has always been a challenge for us when we're going through a design process, is that effectively subsidies, grants, or any form of economic input to a model could potentially change overnight. In fact, pertinent to this, with the Swaffham Pryor project that we've mentioned, this did happen in a big way, where the renewable heat incentive subsidies for the ground source heat pump technology area massively reduced over the course of the development, which is what spurred us to look at air source as a competitor to ground source. But these things, I think it's fair to say, are likely to constantly plague larger, more complex projects that are going to take a longer period of time to develop before they're actually on site and we can register those projects. Feed-in tariffs, ROCs, heat network delivery unit, heat network infrastructure project, the new Green Heat Network Fund, and public sector decarbonisation fund, to name a few. These are all the sorts of things that can create both benefits to projects, but equally, if your project is anchored upon the availability of those things, it can also be quite disruptive if they then fall out or change. And in terms of regulatory, planning policy is also a constantly evolving matter. Callum mentioned how onshore wind was very much banished from UK planning policy a few years ago, and now perhaps that could change. And likewise, it was prior to that, it was the flavour of the month, and then was vanished as well. So these sorts of things can have quite a big implication on our projects as well. And there are still planning policy barriers that exist for us as well that we need to factor in. We've had quite a few challenging planning matters to address over the course of our more complex projects, and I think that will constantly be the case. I think, John, you mentioned the distribution network and the constraints around power distribution, generation, and so on. I think in terms of continued evolution, this is probably the fastest moving beast, where we have, for example, G99 applications for grid connection for solar PV, just to name one, whereas once upon a time it was effectively a simple application where you would either get a no works cost for connection, or you would have an upstream reinforcement cost, a contestable and non-contestable charge, as they'd call it. There are now lots of different tools and techniques that our distribution network operators are using to try and help facilitate projects, like what's called active network management, or timed connections, and flexibility services, and so on. So the point being is you can start today with the project's development. Over the course of those 2 years or year or two of development, those regulatory drivers or policy drivers can change, and that can have a major impact on the viability, both negatively and positively, across the way. Economic evolution. Now, this has already been talked about by Callum, so I won't dwell too much about this, but I think the key point here is, yeah, we know that there has been a massive tectonic shift in the energy markets in the last 18 months. The same can be true. Callum, you didn't mention this so much, but I think it's everyone will know this as well, which is there is a huge amount of inflationary pressure on capital costs that specifically are hitting construction, and even more so the sector of low carbon. So, for example, with solar PV module availability from China, that's a massive issue for us. Shipping and logistics costs is a massive problem for us. Lead times have been pushed out enormously. Heat pump technologies from Europe have been affected through the Ukraine-Russia conflict, as has the availability of effectively pipes, cables, plastic, wood, and concrete. Everything is tougher than it was a year ago to get hold of, and is more expensive. And that creates some level, well, a huge level of uncertainty on economic modelling and forecasting. But equally, we then have that revenue bump that Callum mentioned, which is that the energy markets have massively increased, which helps for any generational savings project because of the revenue that it attracts and the support it gives to the business case. One thing I would say about the economic marketplace, now Brexit has had its impact, and there is a shortfall in the availability of resource generally in the UK at the moment. And that's one thing that also needs to be factored. It's not just about product availability. It's not just about the cost of concrete, but it's also the labour force in the markets at the moment, and actually being able to attract them in. And the economic, big nationally significant projects such as HS2 and let's say what will become Sizewell C, like it or lump it, that will also have a big impact on the availability of resources for projects such as heat networks and ground source in particular, where we need drilling rigs, for example, to drive the piles and those sorts of things. There's quite a few things that mean that there is instability, but also opportunity as well. So any good business case throughout the course of any development should be considering sensitivities around CapEx, OpEx revenue, and seeing it as not what once upon a time might have been one line to represent the project's cash flow. You now need to consider having a high, a low, a reference case, central case, user case of different permutations, so that you get a good, clear understanding of the range of the economic outturns that you might see once you get to the end of a project's development. I've put in the evolution of a client's brief only because it's something that we have seen constantly in our major projects that we've delivered in a positive way, which is that we've seen the tectonic shift from I would say, an economically driven business case to one, or a business driver to one of carbon. So many of our projects, including Swaffham Prior, which is the one that keeps getting mentioned, is it went from being very much a low carbon heat network with a good economic outturn to one of, well, near absolute zero, but certainly net zero in operation, which is a big shift in terms of the engineering solution that we need to employ. But I think the point being that I want to make is that the success criteria are shifting, and it may well be that in 2 years' time, for example, it's gone back to being one of economics. I hope not, but it may well be. And so having a clear understanding of what the key drivers are for a project and any change to those key drivers over the course of development needs to be considered. So I thought I'd just leave us with a few points around what do we do and how do we manage this evolution. I think this, for me, comes back down to the key principles of good, solid project management, that when you're going from a transition from a feasibility into a live project, it's absolutely mandatory that we do have those goals clearly defined, the success criteria, and that we clearly understand what is the pass or fail to a project and how we continually monitor the project against those. Having clear plans and understanding that projects won't be developed overnight, and allowing for, let's say, some of the trip hazards that planning or other statutory processes can take is necessary, so that we're managing expectations and also understanding what the implication of time might be on development. Risk management. So I think having, as soon as we can in the development of any major project, understanding and let's say accelerating risk management processes. So our job at Bouygues, what we're always aiming to do is to qualify out risks at the earliest stage of design, so that we don't get 2 years into a major project and then find that it's no longer deliverable because of a risk that we could have identified in the first month. And that's a really key theme that I would say is necessary for these more dynamic projects that we're developing. Having good quality, good governance and quality control is mandatory as well, I think. And it's something that's often lost when you're dealing with some of the chaos that's working around us and some of the uncertainties in the project environments we have. Fostering a good teamwork and collaborative environment, having a good relationship with the resources you have. There are always going to be multiple stakeholders in these sorts of projects, from Bouygues as a contractor, or any contractor for that matter, and supply chain partners, all the way through to end users and customers and operators of sites that are involved in this. And having that good collaborative environment to work in is absolutely necessary. We'll move on, actually, just conscious of time. I've talked about resourcing, but I just like this slide anyway. But I think the key thing is, at the start of going into a project's development, is having a good understanding of what skills, knowledge and expertise you need to deliver a project, and making sure that those resources are within the project team. And this goes not just in terms of engineering and specialist survey work and what have you, or project management, but also in terms of the right economic capabilities, the right financial project finances, legal, and so on and so forth. So having that eclectic mix of what you need in the project team is mandatory. And finally, I'll just as a reminder, really, that the way I see this is that the RCEF feasibility is just a very short moment in time. It's just the first stepping stone on what will be a very long process of development. It's a very good yardstick as to whether a project is likely to be feasible, but I would say that in many cases, from what we've seen, we ended up with a very different solution to the usually or almost constantly to the benefit of the end customer and the buyer, but it's never kind of exactly what you see in the initial feasibility. projects will morph and they'll change, ordinarily for the better.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Miles. That was a comprehensive overview. I don't know if that's left me feeling a little bit depressed or inspired. I'm not quite sure. And I'm curious about the response from our audience. I did create a little, because there haven't been many questions in the chat, which is unusual. I don't know if that means people are overwhelmed or just have lots of questions that they're not quite ready to share yet. I prepared a very short poll to find out how many people here have got feasibility studies that have got stuck and want some help with them. So I hope you can all see the poll. So do have a look at the poll if you can. And it looks like people are participating. And meanwhile, also do please unmute yourselves. And
Liz, I would on the subject of sort of energy costs and things, as someone who's been around for a bit and been up and down it, as I'm sure you have, I just wanted to share a slide which I think is quite relevant, because I think, you know, when we're looking at the what's going on in the sort of current energy markets, we can slightly lose sort of, you know, we can't see the wood for the trees sort of thing. So this is what the inflation adjusted base of Brent crude oil price has done over the last sort of 20 something years. And those of us who've been around in renewables for a while will remember at the heady days of 2012, 2013, when everything was stable and we could forecast perfectly. We had lovely, highly polished crystal balls, and we knew that base energy costs were pretty much tracking inflation or running slightly above it, and oil was sitting around $100 a barrel, and all was well with the world. And then in 2013, the big oil producers suddenly got a bit scared that they had two threats coming at them. One was renewables, but actually probably a bigger one was fracking. And they just decided to open the tap a bit. And they pushed the oil price down to less than half of that long-term average on a whim. And I think, you know, we've got a particularly peculiar set of circumstances that are pushing up global energy prices just now, but they're unlikely to last for a variety of reasons. And so I think it's ever so difficult when you're looking at the long-term sort of 20-year plan around anything that's based on energy costs. You need to be pretty cautious about it. So just to sort of, you know, we've actually had for the last, getting on for nearly, so certainly 10 years now, we've had, you know, oil around $60 a barrel, and it's bumped up and down a bit. So the current spike to $130 a barrel is an artifact of various global political things. Fundamentally, oil is still very cheap to produce. There's still an awful lot of it in the ground, and there's huge vested interests in making sure we go on using it. And that will come into play.
thank you, John.
I'm sure that hasn't cheered anybody up at all. But anyway,
no, that really hasn't. I'm trying to think of a good response to that. I haven't got one. I'm hoping perhaps somebody else in the group does.
As my son would say, them's the bricks.
Yes.
I don't know what it means, but it seems a good saying to me.
I don't either. I'm just having a look around the people who've got their videos on to see how people are responding to that. Sort of looking at Nick Owens and Martin Heath here. But nobody's really saying anything.
I think the other point that came up was about cost of capital. I mean, I think, you know, obviously we all have objectives in this that aren't to do with money, but nevertheless, if you want to actually fund a sort of multi-million-pound project, at the end of the day, you've got to go and find someone who's willing to lend you the money. And I think those costs are going up. There's an awful lot around what you have to pay to get hold of money, which is related to risk. And unfortunately, instability reminds people of risks that were always there, but they tend to forget. I mean, that was certainly true back in that period I was talking about. Everyone thought that long-term PPAs would be happily sitting at a certain level, and then actually it became clear that it was a bit of a an illusion. And we've just had a big shock to the financial system where everyone's forecast turned out to be wrong. And that then it crystallized risks. It made people feel more risk averse. And inevitably that puts the costs up, irrespective. I mean, obviously we've got a thing that's going on around inflation and base rates going up, but also there is this risk element in there that's pushing up cost of capital. It'd be interesting to hear others' views on that, or anyone's experience of that, of what level of cost of capital they're building into financial models.
Well, before we do that, because we could get into long debates and my head is slightly imploding, because this is not an area of my expertise. What I would really like to know, and I've done a little poll, but in fact only 2 people have answered, is how many people are here who have got a feasibility study? Just raise your hands or shout me or something, who have got a feasibility study that they want to review. Right, we've got Nick, we've got Charmin, I think. Yes, we've got Charmin. Nick and Charmin, would you like to talk about where you've got stuck?
Okay.
We've got a project where we've made good progress through an RCF fund, but I'm speaking as a contractor now, although I also wear a community energy hat for another project, where the grant recipient decided before we got the economics in that the thing was uneconomic. So we're stymied because they won't allow it to go to somebody else, even though there's other people wanting to progress the project. So we're at the point where we're pretty sure we've got something that can be economic, given all the weird stuff going on in the world at the moment and the price variation and everything. But we're now at the point where we need to progress. We know what we want to do. We've got it sized in terms of money, but no money to do it with. So our question actually really is about how do we get some more risk finance for this project, or series of projects, and we're looking at 2 PV projects of 9 and 5 megawatts. So that's quite big in community terms, but it started out with the local authority or the town council being very keen, but the staff changed and they changed their keenness.
And is there any of our speakers or anybody else here who could speak to that? And I'm rather wondering if you could, Ollie.
Sorry,
So you've missed the question.
Yeah, go on.
Which is, Charmin, could you just repeat the question to Ollie, who have a seat?
Yeah, the question is, we're partway through. We think we've worked out our way through the grid problems with some innovative action and help from funding, from RCF funding. Now we're at the point where we need to get funding from somewhere else for the rest of the risk capital. So getting planning permission, doing a rework on the grid, because obviously you have to keep paying to stay in the grid queue, and that costs a fair bit of money. So mainly it's the costing things, really, the planning permissions, planning applications, doing planning permissions, and the grid, paying to get back in and stay in the grid queue.
Yeah,
So the risk capital.
Yeah, the development funds, the development funding, basically, which is it's one of those big questions. And then so how big is what's the size of your project? What is it?
Well, probably 15 million. It's two PV sites of 9 and 5 megawatts.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So for your development costs, what you need? £250,000?
Probably something like that's not in my head at the moment, because I'd only got the RCEF monies in my head, and that's just driving me crazy because the town council decided they didn't like it after all.
Yeah, interesting. Well, there are, this whole development funding is it's a big issue. We're now, I can think of an example where local authorities have been accessed to provide development funding, or other organizations, like Communities for Renewables, working with organizations like that.
We are working with CFR already, actually.
Oh, okay.
They're one of the suffering consultancies in this.
Yes, yeah, quite. Yeah, no, I see what you mean. Yeah, no, it's an interesting one. We're actually having several conversations on sourcing development funding at the moment, because it's coming across the board.
Yeah.
And you know, one area, and I don't know where you're located. Where are you located?
Cornwall.
Oh, in Cornwall. Okay, so obviously, you know, the devolved funds that are going to councils around shared prosperity and rural development funds.
Yes.
Well, yeah, you say that, but however, there are criteria within that where local authorities should be supporting local, you know, renewable projects and things. So if you have,
but they're only interested in shovel ready, which we're not, and their feasibility money is a really small percentage of the total available.
yeah, it's an avenue that I
Yeah.
would take
Oh,
at
sure.
the moment,
Yeah.
because you know they have their net zero goals as well. So yeah.
And I just want to see if Miles or John have anything to add to that discussion.
It's tough.
I, John.
Yeah, I mean the local prosperity funding, all of the attempts we've seen to try and get hold of that have found it really difficult. And you've got the, if it's public sector, you've got the skills fund for public sector decarbonisation, but that's so fiercely competitive that basically you've got to be in there within. It's harder to get than Ed Sheeran tickets or something. You've got to have your finger on the button to get your application in on the minute it opens, sort of thing. So there is definitely a hole in the system at the moment. Having said that, Bays are well aware there's a hole in the system. So I think, you know, there are movements going on within Bays, I think, to try and to sort of find solutions to this, because they know that that's a major barrier to decarbonisation.
Okay, I'm handing over to Martin and then Miles to answer this question, and then to Nick Milnes.
Yeah, well, it wasn't really a question, but it's following on from John's point and Ollie's as well. But there is this gap, this development funding gap. You know, you can get to the stage where you can see a project is very feasible, and most solar PV is, particularly is well cited. It's the issue is that risk. It's the development and construction risk, whereas most of the risks are. I mean, there is ongoing off-taker risk and pricing risk, but most of that can be mitigated quite easily. It's the risk of things like getting planning applications in, getting the grid connection and holding on to the grid connection. And it's that sort of short-term development funding, which is where the gap is for community energy projects. And it's how do we fill that gap? Because that's where the risk is. And you know, if you're looking for investors who are willing to take that sort of risk, then they want a decent return. And it's not the sort of, well, maybe people have a different view, but funding that from community groups is quite difficult because it is quite high risk. In fact, it's very high risk. I've seen people, and I'm not sure where we are with this. There used to be the SEIS investment schemes, and I think they were withdrawn from renewables. I don't know if they've come back, which will at least give some tax advantages for people who make that early investment. But that's, I think, where the gap is. And I don't know the answer to it, by the way. I was just hoping that other people might be able to say, but there are ways of funding this gap, but it's only a short-term gap. It's between getting the initial feasibility, getting the planning, getting the grid connection, and then doing the construction. After that, things can be mainly de-risked. But if anyone's got any ideas of how you find community funding for that little gap, and it's only what 6 months to 2 years, then a lot of these projects will become viable.
Thanks, Martin. So anyone else here have
Ideas?
Yeah. Liz, I think you might need to mute. I think that Thrive Renewables, they already have their community bridge webpage up around the capex and do mezzanine financing, whether they come on as senior or junior lenders. But they have expressed interest in accelerating and de-risking this development stage for community energy groups. I don't think they know what that means in practice yet. And I don't think we know what it means, but potentially working with established community energy groups that already have installed assets that they can leverage and then working with Thrive, yeah, to get that kind of short-term boost to get to the next stages is a possibility. So yeah, I would say watch that space and check out how they potentially move forward on that, because it is, yeah, it is a recognized barrier. And so if a combination of the commercial and community sector can figure it out, then that'd be great.
So interesting.
Liz, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me? Thank you. I'm handing over to Nick Milnes now.
Hi, yeah. Just sort of, I suppose, building
Nick.
on. Can you hear me?
Oh, I can't hear you. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. From Martin's point, that we kind of linked to the sort of pre-development or development stage and the risk associated there. I was just curious, moving forward to the construction stage. I mean, pre-development's got a high risk, but a low risk financially. But at the development stage, or sorry, at the construction stage, it's, you know, your significant sums of money. The reason I bring this up is about product compatibility. I've come from the community-led housing side, and where there's been modern methods of construction, the compatibility is something is fairly unique in terms of that provider, and when they become insolvent, it becomes near impossible to then continue the scheme without basically redoing everything. And so yeah, those kind of insurance products that are available, just yeah, it's just a comment and observation, and any thoughts on that?
So I'm looking to see if anyone has any thoughts.
Well,
Miles.
Yeah,
I mean, the first thought is, yeah, I mean, there's difference, orders of magnitude difference in money that's at risk. Now, it's not insignificant at the planning stage, by the way. I mean, you could be talking £250,000 to get a planning application through with a grid connection. So there's a lot of upfront money that has to be spent. And I think as John made the point in the chat, I mean, the risks of getting planning through, particularly, well, it's always been very, very high for wind. In fact, impossible of getting wind projects through. The planning risks on solar have gone up enormously in the last year, and particularly in the last 3 to 4 months, given what the government have been saying. So there's still pretty significant risks at pre-development. A lot of and then clearly there's the construction risks as well, and a lot of the construction risks are around actually making sure your chosen installer is actually delivering to the spec that you think they are, and they're delivering a system that will actually run for the next 25 years. So there's still considerable risks around that as well. And again, that can be mitigated. But once you've got planning, you've got a grid, and you have a constructed system, the risks are a lot more manageable, which is why we can find financing at that stage, but we can't really find the financing in between. And I know Octopus and Unity have got this £1 million rolling fund, which helps. But again, that's more about financing construction rather than pre-development and planning applications.
Shall I come in there, Liz? Yeah, I saw your note. No, so it's a really good point. I think that what I would suggest is, and this is with my impartial and unbiased hat, not representing Bouygues, but as an industry stakeholder, is I think it's important now more than ever to consider your procurement strategies very carefully when you're going into construction. The renewables industry has been plagued by fly-by-nights that have come and gone and have caused a huge amount of issues in terms of the reputation of technologies, solar farms, that we've seen go wrong, wind turbines, all sorts. There has been a huge amount of issues, often caused by poor quality control, cutting corners, and using poor quality products. I think working with bankable business partners that are going to stay around for the duration of a project's life, or at least for the design liability period, is absolutely principal. If you do want to take the risk and go with a company that hasn't got an established trading history that gives you that level of confidence, then ensuring that they have appropriate runoff insurances themselves, such that if they do go pop, you still have a route back, is really important. When it comes to larger scale solar farms, if you are sort of focusing on that part of the discussion, I would suggest that, I know what was the point I was going to make here, having proper contract administrators in place who can monitor the performance of the contractor during the installation phase and not relying upon what the contractor is telling you is very important to the process as well. Because to have that right level of quality assurance by your own site inspections, unless you're a solar expert, is very difficult to achieve. So I think those are the things that would immediately spring to my mind. As I said, you know, we're in the industry, we are delivering solar farms every day of the year, and a lot of our tier 2 and tier 3 subcontractors, yes, that's right, in fact, owner's engineer is another sort of role that we could mention. It's just been mentioned in the chat there. But we have seen lots of tier 2 and tier 3 subcontractors go pop, even though through our own procurement and QA processes, we're apparently working with those that are least likely to. It's just most important that there is a route back should something go wrong.
Yeah, I'd underline that because we've done quite a lot of due diligence work on post-construction inspection work on projects, and it's quite often you'll find, not always, but often enough, that a project hasn't been delivered to the specification that was agreed in upfront, or indeed on occasions where we've seen systems that have been designed that actually breach warranties, manufacturer warranties. So you've actually got a system where that hasn't got any warranty at all because the installer hasn't installed the system in the correct way. So these construction risks are real and they're there, and they do need to be managed.
Thank you, Martin. It's interesting that we've moved on to construction risk, which is all very relevant, but we've gone away from people like Nick Owens, who came with a heat study, a heat feasibility study he did, what, 4 years ago, and he's wondering if it's worth revisiting it. Do you want to say any more about that, Nick?
Okay, yes, please. So this was for 2 schools, one of which certainly has a fairly inefficient heating system. The idea was to put ground source in, pipe it into both of them, they're adjacent. The capital costs were around, I think, 1.2 mil, and it was based on RHI availability supporting the finances. Unfortunately, it never stacked up, and we're just wondering if it will stack up now when there's no RHI, but energy prices have more or less doubled. So I've not quite got to the point of reviewing the costing spreadsheets properly, just at the beginning of that journey, but interested in any comments that anyone could make on which way we might go forward.
Can I come in on that one as well, Liz? Okay. Yeah, no, really interesting point. I think a couple of points to make is that, first of all, it depends on what level of return is expected, because in blunt terms, regardless of the fact that energy prices have changed, the spark gap still exists. So there is still a big difference between electricity retail price and gas retail price, which means that ratio wise, it hasn't changed at this current time enormously from where it was previously, to the extent where a heat pump project will see a lower energy cost in operation to the point where it would pay itself back in any reasonable timescale. The likelihood is, from what we understand, that whilst gas prices will stabilize at a higher rate than the electricity prices, and long term, it looks more likely that electricity price, the spark gap, will reduce. It would be beyond potentially the timescale for an economic project to be invested for ground source heat pump today. But the thing is, I think we look then toward CapEx. So if you're thinking about the return on investment, the smaller the investment is to begin with, the less return you need in order for it to satisfy itself. And I would look toward, first and foremost, now I think obviously we've just seen the public sector decarbonisation scheme 3B just has been and gone, so we'll have missed that iteration. But there is probably, no one knows the answers to this, Salix keep this very close to their chest, but there is probably going to be a phase 3C or phase 4. And if you're successful with that, that will offset a huge amount of the CapEx cost associated with the heat pump installation. The other point I would still make is, and this was a point that Callum made around efficiencies, is that ground source heat pumps are exceptionally higher cost than air source. If there is an option for either a hybrid scheme with air and ground or an air source led project instead, it may well tip the balance economically, and it is worth considering that, albeit that, you know, without looking at the details of the project, environmental considerations may kick off any air source heat pump project. But it's always looking at the source in finer detail nowadays, because without RHI, without that big bump that ground source did have historically, air source is often more economically viable than ground nowadays.
Okay.
Yep.
That's very helpful. Sorry, just going to come back just to check what's phase 3C and phase 4. I've not come across.
So this is the public sector decarbonisation fund.
Okay,
and
thank you.
It's quite fiercely competed for. But if you've already had a feasibility study done, that means you've already got a whole lot of the data available to you around heat demand and so on. So to get that refreshed, to just look, you know, as suggested, at the alternative of an air source based system and get some numbers together would be probably worthwhile, because in order to succeed in applying for that fund, the more you know about what you want to do, the better. And if you've already got effectively a specification and you're looking for the funding to implement it, that greatly improves your chances. But yes, it's a public sector decarbonisation fund. If you search that on Google, you'll find it. And there has just been a round closed, but there is an expectation there'll be another round, because it's got good take up.
So Nick, is there more guidance you'd need on that?
Undoubtedly there'll be more guidance that I need. That's a start, I think. But I guess I know where to come, Liz. So
okay. Thank you. There are some other people sitting here on the call. We've got 3 minutes. Is there anybody else here who has a feasibility study that they've thought about revisiting and don't know what to do with it? Because I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to see if there are any useful comments. And nobody's answering. So in that case, I think I will declare this webinar closed. I hope it's been useful for people. Oh, Nick Mills, you've added some comments. Do you want to say them out loud?
Yeah, just back to on the feasibility and the use of and the issue of return on investment and consideration of social value, the addition of that. It can be very difficult to get, even with the Social Value Act, but whether it's local authorities or even the contractors, and genuine, if you like, I'll use the word genuine. I'm not saying that people are just labeling things, but it is that thing about jobs, reduce fuel poverty and improved health and well-being.
Absolutely. Yes. People making comments in that you're really welcome to make your comments out loud, like a higher price for carbon. Stuart Bird.
It's been written about many times. There's a sense of inevitability.
Yeah.
Well, yes, I mean the other thing is
Brexit benefit.
Yeah, but actually Europe is starting to move in that direction, and if they do move in that direction, then it would be much easier for us to follow. Let's put it that way.
Yes, it will, Fran. We'll put the recording on YouTube. Have you any questions?
I don't, thank you. It's just been really useful listening to everybody's experiences, and yeah, definitely.
Can I make just a very quick observation as someone who's just about to do a feasibility study and looking at different sizes of projects, that my sort of summary out of all this and from previous webinars is that behind the meter power purchase agreement on a school or a business seems to be the sweet spot for costs, for feasibility. Large scale DNO problems cost of capital, everything you mentioned there seems to, you know, be a bit of a turn off. That and probably from a local perspective, emphasizing what people can do on energy reduction and principally insulation. You know, if we want to save carbon in the short term, until everything settles down in the economic models, those are perhaps the two areas I'm thinking that we should focus on.
Thanks, Stuart. Okay, I think it doesn't look like we've got any more questions or observations. So I'd just like to say thank you very much to Miles, John and Callum for putting the time in to create your presentations, and thank you for your comments. And if anybody would like to a quick 15-minute overview, do let me know and I will point you in, and I'll give you email addresses. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. Thanks. Okay, bye.
Right.